You don't want to be stressed with timelines on this issue. Yeah. So, I did talk about the elected members, and we should formally turn our mind to that and we're doing it. So at the moment you have, as we just discussed, 10. So you could act, with which 9 are councillors, and plus the mayor. You could go to 19, increase by 19 if you wanted, or you could reduce it by 5 if you wanted, to 5 elected members. So there's a range that you could go to, but I do make the observation that remuneration is pool determined, so that's a factor. I'm not hearing a lot of appetite, correct me if I'm wrong, for a major change, but potentially a 1 or 2 around the margins, depending on how that affects the ward makeup. But in your hands, councillors, for your views.
I think to Councillor Fiddington's point of view, it'd be interesting to test the market a little bit, wouldn't it? It's about understanding what the community thinks, and the problem with putting this up there, it's like, how do you put the pros and cons up of, or is it up to the community to come up with this, you know, the pros and fors and against themselves in that regard?
Good question, Your Honour. Your worship, sorry, Your Honour. So that's my legal. It's my legal background coming out. I defaulted into the sorry. Too used to judges. It ultimately depends on the argumentation and initial proposal. So I would put the pros and cons of whatever model you want to do. Even if you went for the status quo, you should still, in my view, have a pros and cons model. It'll be linked to effective and fair representation, but you put that. Bearing in mind they can give you a point of view, that's the purpose of consultation, but it is your judgment at the end of the day about what is appropriate. So you hear what the community's point of view is, but ultimately someone has to make a call. That's in your hands, subject to appeal from the LGC, and you've got to have proper grounds for an appeal. It can't be flippant or frivolous. Yeah.
I think there's, I kind of like what you're saying. I agree that councillors should be paid as a full-time job, so they don't have to hold down 2 jobs, but I don't think you'd ever want it to be a full-time job, because you'd basically eliminate every self-employed person in the country. And I also think about workload. I think the workload balance is about right. You know, when you think about all the various committees and working groups and all of those kind of things on, I think the workload's about right now. I wouldn't want to see it change much, but I'm interested in seeing, because of the ward situation, what it would look like with 8 councillors rather than 9.
What about an extra one? What difference would that make? Yeah.
You just drop down. The councillors just drop down a bit. You just lose percentage points.
On your income. Well, I'm not worried. You're not worried.
Yeah,
about
no,
that,
you're not.
But I'm thinking about the numbers and for the breakdown of what it would do to the borders, or for the
adding one, yeah, as far as the
especially
distribution.
for Geraldine, it would probably mean that Geraldine would stay there, and Temuka Geraldine might actually come a little bit closer to Timaru.
Yeah, it'd be.
And then we would have more people, one more person, to actually help do those jobs, because there's probably quite a few jobs to be done.
You've benefited from lunch.
You could certainly add a +1 scenario to it, as well as a -1 scenario. Yep.
Based on that though, Boothie, I to be fair, I can't imagine having 2 councillors in Geraldine, because the numbers, and you'd be struggling to warrant why you'd have 2. Yeah, I can't. But even just having 2 there would be a bit of a struggle, as far as, well, it would be really. No, it's not that I don't like sharing, it's just I don't know, because I mean, when I look at the other 2 people that put their names forward, you'd have them in this room, and I don't know if that's what you want. Sorry. But yeah.
Just on the issue of full part-time council, that's actually quite a live debate across the country. There are different points of view about that. Some people think full-time council is not as desirable as it might appear at first blush, and so there's pluses and minuses with it. There's no objective answer to that. It depends on, it's a subjective point of view. I know of some areas where people would say, I wish they weren't essentially full-time councillors because of that. So it's again, there is no right answer to that question. It's a judgment to be made by each locality essentially. Yeah.
And is getting remuneration to a point whereby you're attracting, different people or not, our decision based on representation review, it comes into a little bit, but maybe it shouldn't even be a consideration.
The only, you do, it's communities of interest, effective representation, fair representation. Those are your mantra, essentially. And how the numbers roll out, both in terms of plus or minus 10, the ward boundaries, if you have wards, and the number of councils are determined by those three factors. If you depart from those three factors, that's where an appeal would kick in, and, with some, chance that the LGC will make a different view, will come to a different point, and their view is, if there is an appeal, their view is determinative. Community boards under 19J, during a review, we've been talking about wards and representation plus or minus, but you are required to consider the issue of community boards in a representation review as well. First question there is, do you want any, essentially? There are, again, different views about that across the country. Some want to remove community boards, others want to increase them, but that's your first question. But if you do wish to have community boards, the question then is, what is the nature of those boards that you wish? How do you want to play that out? So the questions really are, I've put them up on the board there, whether one or more community boards should be constituted, whether any current one should be abolished or amalgamated essentially with another one, whether the boundaries between the boards should be altered if that's appropriate, and then what are the number of members of the community board? And there's a limit there too, between 4 and 12. Now, you must have at least 4 community boards who are elected, members who are elected, and you can have appointees yourselves as councillors, but you can't be more than 50% of a community board. So the question then becomes, is having done the wards and the community boards may or may not correlate. In my city of Wellington, there are 2 community boards. There's the Macra one and the Tawa one, but the wards don't accord with that. Probably the Tawa one, which I'm familiar with, is a reflection of amalgamation back in '89, where Tawa used to be a borough council. Okay, the northern ward though encompasses much more than Tawa. It's the whole big area, and Tawa's, you could almost argue it's a sort of anomaly, but try to remove it and you wouldn't. Macra very much the same, which is over the hill beyond Karori. So they are 2 examples of 2 boards that aren't necessarily related to the ward boundary per se. They're within a ward. So that's the mind. So I suppose the first question is, are you comfortable with your community board setup, or do you think there's a case for change?
I'm interested, Malcolm, and it might be from 10 to 20,000, but what sort of number should a community board represent, aside from being a community of interest? Because I could argue Te Muka, Geraldine, and these guys would disagree, are one community of interest because they're rural, they're small, type thing. And I guess my specific question, so everyone knows, is whether we need to maintain Pleasant Point when we have councillors representing Point to Muka, 11 k's between them? Within that board, could we say 2 had to come from Point and 6 come from Te Muka? I'm just interested in those sort of scenarios, being that there would be a cost savings as well.
Councillor, based on my experience across the country, I don't think there's any hard or fast rule about how they're made up. They're generally, as I said, just the Wellington example for this is not necessarily related at all to the way the ward makeup in Wellington is, but it's you could argue there's probably a historical aspect to it. Probably in Thames Coromandel, which has, last time I looked, the most sophisticated community boards in terms of numbers, they've, if memory serves, they place them around the various communities that are around the Coromandel district and then delegate a lot of power down to them. So in some respects, I'd argue it's a subjective judgment based on the needs of the locality, and they're obviously going to be different drivers? Is it an effective way of doing it, or don't we want to upset the apple cart, or that's just the way it's always been? Those sort of considerations come to it. But there is a cost to community boards, and so the judgment is about whether the advantages of a more localised advocacy representation type role, which in some respects is what community boards best do, particularly up to councillors. You often get that the boards in many areas have become advocates for their little smaller community within the larger district to councillors, during LTP process or something like that. So again, this is where the localism aspect comes in. What works best for Timaru is essentially the question. And just because there might be a different model in Thames Coromandel or Wellington or wherever, doesn't mean it's necessarily the right model for Timaru. Yeah.
I want to make clear, I don't want them to lose their representation. I'm just asking whether it's effective.
It's a fair question.
Yeah.
That is often the question that is asked across the country. Yeah.
We argue the other way, and that the community board's more important than the representation, to be fair. Because when you look at the work that, than the councillor, because when you look at the work like that the Temuka, Geraldine and Pleasant Point community boards have been doing individually on strategic plans for their towns, that's really valuable work that you wouldn't get, I don't think, through representation, but you definitely get through a community board. What I probably challenge is if the model has to be, and I know this is not the conversation today, Malcolm, if it has to be a community board, could those same outcomes be achieved through a promotion / community group that's not necessarily a formal community board, potentially funded by council, but a different model, but still will deliver the same outcomes?
It's interesting, and I think if they can maintain a senior rugby team, then it's survives as a community. No, but seriously, what's interesting is we've tried to give Pareora some representation through something unofficial, and we've actually really struggled because the ones that were keen, struggled to stay there, and that's probably what a community of a few hundred. But whereas I'm always been of the view, and 4 years ago I think you would have potentially looked at one of those community boards and had a different view, but since we've sort of empowered them and they've got the strategic planning and they've got some of that sort of stuff, so it's how much we invest into them it will be, what you get out of it and how successful they are. But basically, so I think if we're invested in having them and put the resources behind them, then they're always going to flourish. But as soon as we pull back, then it's not likely to be there. Yeah, I'm certainly the status quo as far as the community boards to take it through. They're overthinking it, yeah.
A comment from councillors?
Anything a little bit controversial I would challenge is whether we need both Scotty and I on both community boards. I think you just need to pick one, and because it's double the amount of time for us. I'm not sure that individually we add any more value by both of us being there, and I would, that would be my only thought. Not my only thought, but.
Well, again, you can easily make that decision in terms of the number of appointed members to those boards, and that essentially is your decision. So you can easily, if you feel that that is a more efficient use of councillor time, then that's entirely within your purview to make that decision. Yeah.
So I was just going to say, I think it is, and I don't think there'll be any difference in outcomes at all.
No, and the other element is who should it. I get that you're in those wards, but actually depends on how we balance out the workload within council. Some, likes of yourself, have just ended up loaded with quite a heavy workload, whereas, it's about balancing that, and how do you balance that? And so I think every decision's a possibility to get that right. So everyone's doing a similar workload and it's spread. And that gets the best outcomes ultimately, I would hope.
So provided you just keep under 50%, you can appoint, as from the councillor pool, to the committee boards whomever you like, really, as long as you're under that 50% of majority. So if you wanted to just appoint one, you can.
Or maybe that's where we give back to Pleasant Point and OJ's fans out there. OJ can be.
Quite a few fans.
Comment from councillors. So let me summarise that as a starting proposition. Keep keep the same community boards in place, but review the number of appointed elected members, councillors, to those boards. Is that a fair comment?
So Malcolm, we don't have to give them an option?
No, this is your proposal, yep. You need to set a proposal out about what this is the model we want in your proposal. It then goes to consultation, and in some respects we're in a preliminary consultation phase now, so we have a workshop later on with community board members have been invited. They may have a perspective, but this is sort of preliminary consultation, but your initial proposal is your proposal. This is what I think would work best for Timaru. You then get input formally through the council on that, whether they agree with you or not agree with you, and then you consider whether the comments that you received are fair or unfair, do I agree with them or not. But this is your call, essentially, yeah.
Sorry, Malcolm, just looking at the Ashburton one, because I got that this week as a ratepayer there. So their first consultation has gone out and just asked the questions that you're asking us. Is that because they're doing like a preliminary consultation?
Perhaps you can do that if you want. My own view is that once you settle, as you're required to do by that, your initial proposal, that's your proposal, okay?
Feels to me like they've asked their community before they've done the proposal. Yeah.
It's, which is why I always divide into the three phases. The preliminary, which even that's not provided for in the Act, it's essentially how do I inform myself about what, to the extent that you wish to, about what the community's wants and needs are around this, and you have time to do that because you're not required to finalise initial proposal to the end of July, so you could do that if you wanted to. Or you just say, I'll do a proposal and I'll hear what the consultation is, and then it's you're into the formal aspect of the proposal then, because after the consultation, you've got to settle the final within 8 weeks, I think it is, and then the thing. So you can basically how you want to roll, really. Speak to what Neil and Hamish are doing up there, but it sounds like they're doing preliminary consultation.
Tended to do a bit of pre-consultation on a lot of things of late, yeah.
My own view is if you had an initial proposal that had options in it, that's not an initial proposal. It's by definition, yeah.
And then, Malcolm, do we go to numbers around the community board as well?
In terms of there's limits on the number of elected members per board, and in terms of the numbers, I'd need to just double check that, Your Worship, on that. But the key one being is the number of elected, the number of councillors on it.
Yeah.
But those are, so in wrap up, and we can back to the various permutations. We'd be interested to see what the community board members say this evening about what their perspective is. But I look at that as I call that part of preliminary consultation because you're seeking their view. But you go out, as I say, and ask, the community if you wanted to. But once you issue that initial, you're in the process, yeah. To remind you of that, you've got to publicly notify the consultation, there's an appeal, if they want, there's objections later on, and then decision by that. So that's your timeline. And this is to the Councillor Pye's point just there. Preliminary consultation can go through to 31 July 2024, because prior to that point you don't necessarily have to do your initial. So and how you wish to do that is, and so you see in my final bullet there, councillor, I said consider the nature of public input at this stage, if any, that you want to talk to them. And then we're in that, as I've already talked about. So those were the, oh, sorry, I pressed the wrong button again, sorry. Those are the sort of factors. So we've tried to get a sense from you about where your sense of it is, about what it would be useful scenarios to come back with. Do you feel we've captured that well enough? Well, the next set will be when you get that first set of papers, which may or may not result in an initial proposal, potentially more work, but we're trying to work to around about February, March to get that to you, so there's plenty of time for you, so you're not under a compressed time frame. Though it would be useful, I suppose, to get feedback during that period for officers about the nature of further consultation prior to the initial proposal would probably be helpful, because if council wanted to do that, we'd need to schedule that in.
Have a desire to do that. I was just trying to understand the difference between what Ashburton were doing and what we were doing.
It's a wrap by the looks of it, I think. So no further questions, team? Yeah, thank you, Malcolm. That's covered everything, so I really appreciate that, and we can sign out. Thank you. Catch all those on live stream later.
For your time, councillors, your worship, that's very helpful for us, because we needed some sense of guidance about where to go.